Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from Rao's IAS Study Circle. Join the official Telegram channel of Rao's IAS Study Circle to stay updated and get all the materials on the Telegram. The link to the channel can be found in the description box. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading from our UPSC Civil Services examination perspective. Now today, let us take up the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 23rd June 2021. The news to be taken up for today's discussion has been displayed on the screen and timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below of the YouTube channel. So on this note, let's start our today's discussion from our prelims and mains perspective. Now let's take up our first news appearing on page number 12. It says, tying reforms, incentives helped widen adoption. Prime Minister cites states extra financial year 2021 borrowings. Now the Prime Minister in this news highlights that the economic crisis which has been caused due to COVID-19 pandemic has been once in a century crisis. And in this regard, the government has turned this crisis into an opportunity by bringing about long pending reforms, especially in the field of agriculture through farm acts, in the field of manufacturing through production linked insurance schemes, and also by liberalizing foreign direct investment in the sectors of coal mining, insurance, as well as defense manufacturing. So in this backdrop, the Prime Minister has highlighted that India has moved from the model of reforms by stealth and compulsion to the newer model of reform by conviction and incentives. So the state governments are given an incentive to borrow more if they carry on with certain reforms. So this is where the concept of reforms by conviction and incentive becomes important. Also because this additional borrowing provided to states in times of crisis has been announced as a part of Atmanirbhar Bharat package. So if the states carry on certain reforms, then the center will provide incentives in the form of extra borrowing of the state's gross state domestic product. And here, central government has increased the borrowing limits of states from 3% to 5% for the year 2020-21. And this decision was taken on 17th May 2020 during the COVID pandemic. Now this decision to borrow extra 2% is based on fulfillment of certain aspect of reforms. And as per the government sources, half of the special dispensation, that is half of this extra 2%, which is 1% of states' GSDP, was linked to undertaking citizen-centric reforms by the respective state governments. So, if respective state governments carried on reforms with respect to certain areas provided by the central government, then they were entitled to the extra 1% borrowing of the state's GSDP. So in this regard, the areas of citizen-centric reforms which were identified by the Department of Expenditure were implementation of One Nation One Ration Card system, especially with respect to Aadhaar seeding of ration cards and also beneficiaries in the states, along with automation of all fair price shops in the state. Now the One Nation One Ration Card system reforms and its implementation ensures availability of ration to beneficiaries under the National Food Security Act and also with respect to other welfare schemes. And overall, implementation of One Nation One Ration Card system helps the migrant workforces and their families to procure food at any fair price shops across the country. So implementation of One Nation One Ration Card system was identified by the Department of Expenditure as one of the areas for citizen-centric reforms for which states can borrow extra 1% of states' GSDP. Other aspect is with respect to ease of doing business reforms in the states, urban local body utility reforms in the states, and also power sector reforms, especially with respect to reducing losses for the DISCOMs. Now these areas of citizen-centric reforms becomes important, especially from your prelims perspective, as questions may be asked, especially with respect to the additional borrowing of 2% provided to state governments based on fulfilling certain criteria as a part of Atmanirbhar Bharat package. So in this direction, let us also understand the concept of borrowings by state as has been provided under Article 293 of the Indian Constitution. Now regarding the borrowing limit of state fixed at 3% of state GSDP, this is generally provided by the Finance Commission's report and it is also contained in respective states' FRBM acts. So this aspect also becomes important from your prelims point of view. Now with this, let us understand the concept of borrowing by states as provided under Article 293 of the Indian Constitution. Now Article 292 of the Indian Constitution provides for unlimited borrowing powers for the central government. However, this idea of an unlimited borrowing powers does not apply to the state governments. So the central government has unlimited borrowing powers both within India and also outside India. However, limits with respect to center's borrowings can be fixed by Parliament by law. And this aspect has been provided under Article 292 of the Indian Constitution. So if we go through Article 292, it says borrowing by the Government of India. It says that the executive power of the Union extends to borrowing upon the security of the Consolidated Fund of India within such limits which may be fixed from time to time by Parliament by law, and also to the giving of guarantees within such limits, if any, as may be so fixed. So we understand that Parliament may by law fix the limit with respect to borrowings of the centre. However, the central government has powers to borrow both from within India and also outside India. However, with respect to states, as provided under Article 293 of the Indian Constitution, the power is generally limited with respect to borrowings by states, and also the fact that states cannot borrow from outside India. Now, this borrowing powers of state is not only limited but also conditional upon certain circumstances. Thus, the state government can borrow from Government of India or even raise public loans. But raising of public loan or even borrowings from the Government of India is conditional for a state if any outstanding part of the loan made by the Government of India or previous government still remains with the state government. So in such situation, if there is already an outstanding part of the loan which remains, then with respect to borrowing of the state, consent of the central government becomes necessary. So in such cases where outstanding part of the loans for a state government still remains, then further loan approval can only be approved if the central government consents to such borrowing by state governments. Now, important point to be understood here is that since states mostly remains indebted to the central government, hence central government effectively controls the amount of public debt raised by state governments. So clause 3 of Article 293 states that a state may not without the consent of Government of India raise any loan if there is still outstanding any part of a loan which has been made to the state by the Government of India or by its predecessor government, or in respect of which a guarantee has been given by the Government of India or by its predecessor government. Further, clause 4 of Article 293 states that a consent can be granted to the state governments with respect to loans subject to such conditions, if any, as the Government of India may think fit to impose. So these provisions makes it amply clear that central government effectively controls the amount of public debt raised by state government. Now another question which arises is that can states borrow from outside India? As per Article 293, the answer is no. So state governments under Article 293 have no power to raise loans outside India. However, some of the international agencies such as IBRD, IDA, ADB, etc. have been providing loans for funding various projects in the states. Now, in such cases, the central government acts as a facilitator and enables the state to directly borrow from such agencies. Now, in 2017, this particular decision was made by the central government, whereby the central government enabled the financially sound states to borrow directly from these external agencies, however, subject to fulfillment of certain conditions. Now, in such loans, the guarantor is the state government, whereas the Government of India acts as a counter guarantor. So, state governments cannot directly borrow from these international agencies unless the Government of India acts as the counter guarantor. So, these are some of the important developments with respect to borrowing powers of states from outside India. Now, this topic becomes important both from your prelims and mains perspective. In the prelims, question can be asked with respect to important features regarding the borrowing powers of center and states under Article 292 and 293 of the Indian Constitution, and also with respect to economic and social development, sustainable development, as well as poverty and inclusions. Whereas in your mains, question can be asked in GS paper 2 regarding the important aspect of Indian constitution, especially with respect to the borrowing powers of center and states, and also the functions and responsibilities of union and states, especially regarding their financial powers, and also under GS paper 3, especially regarding the issues relating to Indian economy and inclusive growth and issues arising from it. So after this discussion, let's take up our next article. The next article to be discussed appears on page number 8. It says 4 theatre commands likely this year. The Prime Minister of India is expected to make the announcement of their launch soon. So this news effectively talks about launching or creating theatre commands. Now the purpose of theatre command is to galvanize or increase synergy, especially with respect to resources, assets and also operations, especially of the defense forces, to tackle any threats along India's borders and also along the seas. So it is in this regard, the idea is to create synergy between the Indian Army, Indian Navy and also the Indian Air Force. So in order to have this kind of increasing synergy or jointness in terms of operation to tackle any threat, these theatre commands will have units of Army, Navy and also Air Force. So the whole purpose of these theatre commands is the jointness of operation which is carried in times of any threat. Now considering the jointness of the operations with respect to these theatre commands, these units under the theatre commands will work as a single entity to address any of the security challenges in a specified geographical territory. Now here we must understand that India faces border threats both from western side with respect to Pakistan and on the eastern and northern side with respect to China. So here the jointness of operation will help in tackling the border challenges emanating from the western side and also from the eastern and northern side. It further highlights that the single entity to address the security challenges in a specified geographical territory shall be under an operational command. Thus the whole idea of having a theatre command is with respect to increasing synergy between Indian Army, Navy and Air Force, and also to have a jointness of operation in terms of any security or threat challenges. Now the 4 theatre commands which has been proposed are Air Defence Command, Maritime Theatre Command, Integrated Eastern Theatre Command and also Integrated Western Theatre Commands. Now since this is a developing story, so let's wait for the Prime Minister approval of these 4 theatre commands. Now from our UPSC prelims perspective, we need to know about the Chief of Defence Staff, as the Union Cabinet chaired by Prime Minister in the year 2019 December created this post of Chief of Defence Staff in the rank of a 4-star general having salary and perquisites equivalent to a service chief. Now the Chief of Defence Staff also heads the Department of Military Affairs which has been created within the Ministry of Defence. And the Chief of Defence Staff functions as the Secretary of Department of Military Affairs. Now another important aspect is that these areas will be dealt by the Department of Military Affairs headed by the Chief of Defence Staff, which includes Armed Forces of the Union, namely the Army, Navy and the Air Force, integrated headquarters of the Ministry of Defence comprising Army Headquarters, Naval Headquarters, Air Headquarters and Defence Staff Headquarters, their Territorial Army, works relating to the Army, Navy and the Air Force, and procurement exclusive to the services except capital acquisitions, which is to be done by the Defence Acquisition Council headed by the Defence Minister. Now regarding the role of Department of Military Affairs, it will have a prominent role with respect to promoting jointness in the procurement, training and staffing for the services through joint planning and integration of the requirements, facilitation of restructuring of military commands, for optimal utilization of resources by bringing about jointness in operations through establishment of joint or theatre commands and promoting use of indigenous equipment by the services. So these can be said to be the important role of Department of Military Affairs. Thus this news becomes important primarily from the perspective of security and challenges in your prelims examination. With this, let's move to the next article. Now the next news to be taken up also appears on page number 8. It says world's first genetically modified rubber sapling planted in Assam. And the institute says that this GM plant of rubber is tailored for the climate of Northeast. So in this regard, we need to understand few aspects with respect to the plantation of rubber and also how genetically modified rubber will enhance in the overall production of rubber plantation. So this news basically highlights that a rubber board research farm on the outskirts of Guwahati has planted the world's first genetically modified rubber plant, which is tailored for climatic conditions in the northeast. So by going through this particular line, we understand that rubber plantation is not conducive to grow in the cold conditions of northeast. It says that the plant was developed at Kerala-based Rubber Research Institute of India. The news further says that the GM rubber has additional copies. So to enhance the qualities of rubber plant, gene modification was done. And here it says that additional copies of the gene MnSOD or manganese containing superoxide dismutase was inserted in the rubber plant. And this gene is expected to tide over severe cold conditions during winter, which is a major factor affecting the growth of young rubber plants in the region. So clearly, the rubber plantation cannot survive in the cold season or during the cold conditions. Now the rubber plant can be said to be an example of plantation agriculture. It says that plantation agriculture was introduced by Europeans in the colonies situated in the tropics. Some of the important plantation crops are tea, coffee, cocoa, rubber, cotton, oil palm, sugarcane, bananas, and also pineapples. Now it says that the characteristic features of this type of farming, that is plantation farming, are large estate or plantations, large capital investment, managerial and technical support, scientific methods of cultivation, single crop specialization, cheap labor, and a good system of transportation which links the estates to the factories and markets for the export of the products. So we understand that rubber is a plantation crop. Now regarding the rubber plant, NCERT highlights that this is an equatorial crop, but under special conditions, it is also grown in the tropical and subtropical areas. So please remember these important points with respect to the rubber plantation. It says that it requires moist and humid climate with rainfall of more than 200 centimeter and temperature above 25 degrees Celsius. So now we clearly understand that this genetic modification of rubber plantation will help this particular plant to survive the cold conditions in Guwahati or in the northeastern region, so that this plant can be grown on a large commercial scale. The NCERT further highlights that rubber is an important industrial raw material and is mainly grown in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka and Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and also the Garo Hills of Meghalaya. Now regarding the major plantation crops found in the tropical regions of the world include rubber, mostly in Malaysia, coffee in Brazil, tea in India and Sri Lanka. So these can be said to be some of the important aspects not only with respect to the rubber plant but also regarding the plantation agriculture. So after understanding the growing conditions of rubber plant, we understand that the genetically modified rubber plant will eventually lead to boost in rubber production. Now in general, genetic modification in plants have been useful in various ways, as these genetic modification has made crops more tolerant to abiotic stress such as cold, drought, salt or heat, reduced reliance on chemical pesticides, that is they no longer rely only on the pesticides. The modified genes inserted in the plants help to reduce post-harvest losses. Genetic modification overall help to increase the efficiency of mineral usage by plants, as this also prevents early exhaustion of fertility of soil and also enhance nutritional value of food. Example, enhancement of vitamin A in rice. It further says that in addition to these uses, GM has been used to create tailor-made plants to supply alternative resources to industries in the form of starches, fuels and even pharmaceuticals. So genetic modification of the rubber plant will help the plant to grow in such seasons or in such temperatures which are not conducive for normal rubber growth. And effectively, this will overall help in increasing the yield of this plant. Now the topic of GM rubber plant or genetically modified rubber plant becomes important both from our prelims and mains perspective. In the prelims, questions can be asked with respect to science and technology and also with respect to India and world geography, including economic geography with respect to the rubber plant. And in the mains, questions can be asked with respect to GS paper 3, especially regarding achievement of Indians in science and technology and also conservation, environmental pollution and also degradation. So with this discussion, let's move to the next article. The next news to be discussed appears on page number 8 and also on page number 11. The news on page number 8 says Afghan violence has risen. As per the External Affairs Minister Jai Shankar, he says that the country's territory must not be used by terrorist groups to attack any other country. Whereas news on page number 11 highlights that no military solution to Afghan situation, US tells Taliban. The US says that military path will not lead to legitimacy. So the crux of both these news highlights that despite the peace talk between US and Taliban last year, violence in Afghanistan has increased. And the violence has increased post announcement of US pullout or withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, seeing this increased violence in Afghanistan by Taliban, the United States has warned Taliban that by adopting military path will not give Taliban any sort of international legitimacy. Further, the US has also warned Taliban that military solution to Afghanistan is not an option. And here the US has also said that establishment of any government by force by Taliban will not be recognized by the world leaders. And also restoration of Islamic Emirates is also not an option for the Taliban. So the only way forward for Taliban is negotiated and inclusive political settlement through Afghan-led and Afghan-owned process. And this must be achieved through peaceful resolution in Afghanistan. Now, despite these warnings, Government of India has put forward its apprehension, especially with respect to increasing violence in Afghanistan. Now, the first aspect of India's increasing apprehension is with respect to growing Pakistan's shadow in Afghanistan through the presence of Taliban. Now, India is worried that Pakistan army will now play a major role in the power dynamics within Afghanistan, as already the Pakistan Army Chief has been visiting Afghanistan or Kabul recently. The next point of worry for India is with respect to strengthening of terrorist groups at the border. So the terrorist groups harmful to India are likely to be bolstered with victory of Islamic fighters over a superpower. Now groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, etc. may take this opportunity to push for heightened levels of insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir. So India fears growing instability in Jammu and Kashmir. Another aspect for which India is apprehended or worried is with respect to India's economic interest in the region. Now, India has already invested deeply in infrastructure, education, power generation and even irrigation development projects in Afghanistan. Now, infrastructure projects like the building of Shahtood Dam near Kabul may get delayed or scrapped because of India's apprehension. So clearly there is risk to India's economic interest in Afghanistan. Another aspect why India is worried is with respect to receding India's diplomatic influence in the region, as India was not able to make any substantial linkages with the Taliban till now. Now, any takeover in Kabul by Taliban will leave India out of its diplomatic influence in the region. So, considering the peace process in Afghanistan, India's stand has always been that the peace process must be Afghan-led, Afghan-owned and Afghan-controlled. But the recent spate of violence is not giving any hope to the government of India. So the question remains as to what are India's options. The first option is to diversify the engagement with Taliban. Now historically India has not accepted the role of Taliban in Afghanistan peace process. So India should be accommodative in opening its door to the Taliban leadership. Now here India had historical relations with the Pashtun community, and this historical relation with the community must be revived. And Government of India must also drop the old policy of only talking to select groups. But now, India should also open backdoor channels with all the major groups, including Taliban. The next aspect is that India must engage with Iran and Russia and form the Russia-Iran-India axis. Now this is because there has been change in the approaches of both Iran and Russia towards the Taliban, as both had been supportive of Northern Alliance and had serious issues with Taliban in the past. So Government of India should use its good relations with Iran and Russia to form a Russia-Iran-India axis to deal with the future in Afghanistan. Now another aspect is that Government of India must continue its investment in Afghanistan, and only self-reliance can lead to stability. Now this is because even Taliban has been in favor of India's supportive role in the region. The next aspect highlighted is with respect to enhancing bilateral trade with Afghanistan, as it will help India retaining its diplomatic leverage irrespective of who is in power. And lastly, India must continue intelligence sharing and also training exercise with Afghanistan security forces, as militarily strong Afghanistan civilian government will have better bargaining power at the table in intra-Afghan peace talks with Taliban. So these can be said to be some of the options which India can exercise with respect to growing presence of Taliban in Afghanistan. Now this topic becomes important both from our prelims and mains perspective. In the prelims, questions can be asked with respect to current events of international importance, and in the mains, question can be asked under GS paper 2, especially with respect to India and its neighborhood relations and effect of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interest. So with this discussion, let's move to the next article. Now the next news to be taken up appears on page number 4. It says 8 rare pygmy hogs released in Manas National Park in Assam. Now this news becomes important primarily from your prelims perspective, and here you need to know about pygmy hog and the fact that it is endangered as per IUCN Red List, and also the fact that it has been provided under Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. So this news highlights that the pygmy hog belongs to the family of pigs, native to the alluvial grasslands in the foothills of Himalayas at an elevation of 300 meter, and today the only known population of pygmy hog lives in Assam in India and possibly in southern Bhutan. Now another aspect highlighted in the news is with respect to the Pygmy Hog Conservation Program. Now this program is a collaboration among Dural Wildlife Conservation Trust of UK, Assam Forest Department, Wild Pig Specialist Group of International Union for Conservation of Nature and Union Environment Ministry, and is currently being implemented by NGOs such as Aranya and Ecosystems India. Thus, this news primarily becomes important from your prelims perspective, and questions can be asked in the section of environment, especially with respect to the IUCN status of pygmy hog, which is endangered, and also with respect to the protection status provided to pygmy hog under Wildlife Protection Act, which has been provided under the first schedule. So with this discussion, let's take up our last article. Now the last news to be taken up appears on page number 6 in the editorial section. It says policy creep. Over-regulation risk retarding growth and job creation in the e-commerce sector. Now the Indian e-commerce industry has seen rapid growth in the last few years, and it is expected to become the second largest e-commerce market in the world by the year 2030. And here the growth is being driven by a young demographic profile, increasing internet penetration, and relatively better economic performance of India. However, number of economists have highlighted that the e-commerce companies have adopted number of ways which have led to unfair competition with the brick and mortar stores. So the aspect highlighted in the article is not only with respect to the rapid growth of the e-commerce industry, but also adoption of unfair competition to stay in the market. Now the Government of India last year in July 2020 had formulated the Consumer Protection E-commerce Rules 2020. And the scope of these rules apply to all goods and services brought or sold over digital or electronic network, including digital products. It applied to all models of e-commerce, including marketplace and inventory models of e-commerce. It applied to all e-commerce retail, including multi-channel single brand retailers and single brand retailers in single or multiple formats. And it also applied to all forms of unfair trade practices across all models of e-commerce being practiced in India. Now, considering the unfair competition adopted by the e-commerce industry, the government has now proposed amendments to this Consumer Protection E-commerce Rules of 2020. And in this regard, the government is seeking comments from the public for the proposed amendment. So first of all, let us go through some of the unfair trade practices which are being adopted by the e-commerce companies. First is regarding the exclusive tie-ups with the mobile phone companies, thereby leading to a monopolistic market, because this prevents the brick and mortar shops to sell those mobile phones. So effectively, because of these exclusive tie-ups with respect to mobile phones or any other products, brick and mortar shops are unable to sell such mobile phones or even other products. Further, adoption of unfair trade practices by the e-commerce firms can also be seen with respect of engagement of these e-commerce firms in manipulating search results to promote certain sellers, providing preferential treatment to some sellers, and also selling goods close to expiry date, etc. Another aspect of unfair trade practice adopted by the e-commerce firm is with respect to engaging in flash sales, where e-commerce entities sell goods at a significantly reduced prices and high discounts or attractive offers are provided for a predetermined period of time. Now, this aspect of flash sale enables only certain selected and privileged sellers to sell goods on the e-commerce platform. So again, this exclusive deal with these certain sellers or privileged sellers in a way distorts trade and thereby distorts competition in the market. Further, most of these sellers or privileged sellers are those who are indirectly controlled by the e-commerce companies or with whom the e-commerce companies have certain kind of engagements. So it is only these privileged sellers who benefit through these flash sales, and the brick and mortar sellers are completely left out of the entire selling mechanism. Hence, in order to improve these regulatory oversights over these e-commerce companies, the Ministry of Consumer Affairs last year notified the Consumer Protection E-commerce Rules of 2020. And now, considering these distorted trade practices by the e-commerce companies, government has proposed amendment to these Consumer Protection E-commerce Rules of 2020. And now the government is seeking comments from the public for the proposed amendments. Now, some of the proposed amendments include appointment of Chief Compliance Officer, restrictions on flash sales, etc. Now, important point to be noted is that as of now, these new rules are still in the draft stage and have not yet been finalized. Now, from our examination perspective, these different models of e-commerce, namely marketplace model and inventory model, becomes important, especially from the perspective or from the backdrop of FDI. So, marketplace model means a model which does not maintain or sell its own inventory. Such a model merely offers digital platform to bring together consumers and merchants, whereas the inventory model maintains and sells their own products. Now, regarding the present FDI guidelines in the e-commerce industry, 100% FDI is allowed under automatic route in the marketplace model of e-commerce, that is here. However, FDI is not permitted in inventory based model of e-commerce. So this again becomes important to know from our prelims perspectives, especially regarding FDI with respect to inventory model and also marketplace model. Thus this news becomes important both from our prelims and mains perspective. In the prelims, this topic gets covered under economic and social development, and in the mains, questions can be asked under GS paper 3 with respect to aspects of Indian economy and investment models, and also under GS paper 2 with respect to government policies and also mechanism or laws for the protection and betterment of vulnerable sections of the population. Now, based on our discussion, this becomes the practice question for the day. The question is, consider the following statements. First, plantation agriculture was introduced by the Europeans in colonies situated in the tropics. Second, some of the important plantation crops are rubber, coffee, sugarcane, bananas, etc. So the question is, which of the statements given above are correct? Options are A, 1 only, B, 2 only, C, both 1 and 2, and D, neither 1 nor 2. Now, coming to the answer of yesterday, the question was, consider the following duties of Chief of Defence Staff. Options are, first, Head of Department of Military Affairs, second, Permanent Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, and third, Principal Military Advisor to the Raksha Mantri on all tri-services matters. So here the question was, which of the statements given above are correct. So here the correct answer is D, that is 1, 2 and 3. So with this, we come to an end to today's analysis. Thank you for watching DNS.